So you have written a homebrew setting and you're ready to drown your players into details. Small advice, don't! Welcome to the Attic Dungeon. My name is Sam, and whether you want to wrap your players in world facts or lay down the lore on them, I'm here to help you with everything. Here I am again, spouting out my usual nonsense, and as always, thanking you, my loyal, not so loyal viewer, for spending your time with me on this rather warm spring day here in the Attic Dungeon. There's room for many more, so do not hesitate to invite your friends and your family to follow my channel and listen to me babble on until we're all dust. Thank you for spreading the good word. So, you are a dungeon master, and maybe you already have a bit of experience and you've decided to create your own setting. Wonderful, excellent, keep on going, channel the energy into something positive. You've quite possibly already created an epic campaign that will take your players from level 1 all the way to level 20 through many hardships and, quite frankly, epic moments where many foes will attack them and do devious things and your players will persevere and la-di-da-di-da-di. There we are, you know. Now, the very important question here is, how do you handle giving lore to your players? And why do I do this in the larger framework of a homebrew setting? Because that's when people get really enthusiastic and just want to hand out books and books and books and books of lore to your players. Don't. There we are. How do you deal with handing out lore to your players at the start of a campaign? Very little, actually. You hardly deal with it at all. How do you show them the awesome world that you've created, the interesting laws of physics and nature that are very different there than in the earth that we live in? Hardly spend any attention to it whatsoever unless it's really, really, really relevant. But then how could you possibly relay the information that you have gathered into your Tolkien-sized world book onto your players? You don't. I think I've made my point by now. And don't get me wrong, because I really meant it when I said that creating your own setting is absolutely wonderful. I have one myself, and I think that everything that I have ever written, adventure-wise, takes place in my homebrew world. It is used very frequently. I think up to now I've written like a tiny part of a campaign and about 15 one-shots, and they all take place in my homebrew setting. My players have been there multiple times. Some of them even remember the details by now. But it is really bad voodoo to expect your players to study the geography and the mythology and the 1,000-year-old history of the local empire that you're dropping them in. This is going to be one of those personal opinion things, specifically aimed at helping dungeon masters on how to disseminate all that information that you have as the dungeon master towards your players. If you're using a pre-written module, this is less of a problem because the book provides you with all the information that you should provide to your players. But as a dungeon master, I know from experience that some people are, and they should be, proud of what they have created and they want to share as much as possible with their players. But that's not always necessary, and to be quite frank, the interest is not always there in the player group to learn the entire world mythology of your weird world. But there are good ways to handle this and to let players enjoy your very rich and immense world filled with details of all different kinds. And that's a very simple and logical way if you think of it. You feed it to them one bit at a time. I'm not saying that you need to treat your players as if they are babies, but one bit at a time, if please. I didn't use the term Tolkien-sized world book for nothing, because actually the way the great writer himself handled stuff like that worked pretty well. Most of you will know Tolkien, I think. He's obviously the chap who wrote The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings saga. And if you read those books, or if you watch those movies even, it's an immense world, Middle-earth, quite big, but you only learn about the places where they go, about the relevant bits of lore, and here and there there's a vague elven song included. And that's actually a really good way of handing out information to your players. You know, you get the information about the Shire because that's where you start. You get the information about the point you're going to, and so on and so on and so on and so on. At no point in the main story Tolkien says, right, now I'm going to spend 100 pages to tell you about the current power structure of the areas of Rudar and Rune. Why not? The story never goes there. But then on the side note, by the way, the chap did write the Silmarillion. There's loads of work produced by his son, which are obviously writings of the father, that give more detail to the world. The appendices in the storybooks of The Lord of the Rings give great detail into stuff that doesn't happen during the main story, but some people might be interested in. And that is how I like to treat my handing out of lore during my stories. I have quite a bit of stuff written out. There's a nice amount of detail, more than I need to run my stories written out. But I will only hand my players what they need, and if they're interested, or if they wind up in some weird side quest that even I didn't provide, I am ready to tap into my vast amount of lore, and I will be able to provide them with stuff. And if I can't provide them with stuff, I'll make it up on the fly. I did it last week, worked fine. And that's the main message, actually. I fell silent for a moment, but that is actually the main message for today. You should feed lore about your homeworld and setting in general, bit by bit. First bit that you feed is obviously if you're doing a session 0. During the session 0, you'll say, look chaps, this is the world you're in, this is the basic stuff that you need to know. Maybe, for example, let's take another famous world. If you look at the games of Skyrim, Oblivion, Morrowind, there's loads of elves, but anything that closely resembles a dwarf has long gone extinct. That is relevant lore as Dungeon Master to share with your player. Look, we had a wonderful bunch of Goliaths, but they got genocided by the Tieflings. Oh well, there's only 5 left. Chances that you're one of those 5, very, very, very slim indeed. Stuff like that is session 0. And then you start very locally. Your players are obviously going to start somewhere, provide them with bits of information that they either need or that they already know about that place. If they start in a small village and some of the players grew up there, they're going to know who's in power, they're going to know who runs the local inn, stuff like that. But they will not know the current political power struggle that the king of that region is doing with spies from the enemy kingdom. That is way out there. You know this, you've written this, and I'm going to be absolutely sure that when this pops up into your storyline, it's going to be amazing, but keep it on the down low. Just feed the players the information that they need to know about the location that they're in, about the people in that location that are relevant, and whatever they might know because of their background. That's the next important step. There is one global bit of information that I deem important and that you should hand out to your players whenever certain classes appear in your game. If you have a cleric, possibly divine sorcerer, celestial warlock, or a paladin if they're going the old-fashioned religious route, you are going to need your pantheon. I think that's one of the first things that I designed when I was doing my world, except for like macro geology and geography. Then I did my deities in the full pantheon, because I had a cleric last week in my world. They obviously need to know which god they are worshipping. He was a very zealous, promoting the work of the gods type of cleric, so he needed at least to know the name and whatever the god he was preaching for stood for. So regionally important info deities and possibly a bit of mythology that could be relevant to whatever quest they're doing. Any travel info, they're heading to place X, comes from the same logic. What do the players know? Is any of the players native to the region, or are they from a completely other place? What do they know about the city they're traveling to? And don't be afraid, this is on the side note, but you don't have to make players roll for every bit of knowledge they want to recall. If they have a good reason to know this bit of information, they've been to the city in 20 times in the past year, they are going to know quite a lot of things about the city given that information. And I think actually that's most, and this might be disappointing for some dungeon masters, but that is actually everything your players need to know at the start of a campaign. They just need to know where they are, a few relevant figures, your pantheon, if any, and the big things related to your settings. Any big do's or don'ts, like warlocks are absolutely outcasts. Then the warlock player will have to know that he has to pretend to be a sorcerer, for example. Oh no, I have had these powers from birth because my mom made a pact with the devil at birth, but hey, that's the detail. You see, stuff like that. Anything else? The rich history of the long-lost half-dwarven race of Umbreon, or whatever you've come up with, are not relevant. They are wonderful. And it's great that you have that, because everything that you write is going to provide you with a huge amount of story hooks, with ways to branch out your campaign and make those bits relevant. Or maybe your players are interested. It happens that players are actually interested in your setting and will perform some research into one of your vague stories. That's when you toss it out. And maybe when a campaign is over or you're past a certain point and your players express interest in your lore and your world, feel free to lay down the lore on them. Give them the full world book. Don't hesitate. And above all, be proud of what you write. But when it comes to campaign, prep work, and information that you give to your players, think as if you're a pre-written module. What is relevant? When you play Horde of the Dragon Queen, you get a little bit of information about the Sword Coast because that is relevant. I don't get information about all the other places in the Forgotten Realms. I think this is actually shorter than I predicted that it would be, but I really wanted to help Dungeon Masters today a bit with that, because I noticed that a lot of people, well, not a lot of people, I've seen people struggle with creating a world and then kind of getting stuck on how do you start presenting this to your players, because you usually start to think pretty big, world, deities and whatever, and it takes a while before you work down to the level of detail that you actually need for your players to function in. Like, who is the mayor of the third small town next from the capital is one of the last things you write down. First you need like world, deities, countries, maybe a few kings and councils, and then you come to maybe a capital city. That's only like step 6 or 7, and then you start looking around for villages. And when you're writing for a campaign, for a story, you actually need to start from the smallest part and work up to the big part. So those two styles of writing are going to meet in the middle, but writing a world is not the same as writing a setting for a campaign. I think that's actually the main message I want to hand out here. You need that information, and truly, I think it's always amazing when people start writing their own world. Whether I like it or not, people are putting energy in a creative process, and that's generally good stuff, unless creating your world involves killing people or whatever. Then don't, not a big fan. But if you're creating a world, that's good. But don't forget that if you're writing to create a campaign, once the big stuff is done, start thinking about your campaign. Start thinking about what you want your players to experience, and swap your point of view to the micro level, and then work up to the macro stuff that you've already written. You will introduce your storyline. I forgot about that, but there's like maybe 3 components. You have micro, macro, micro, and your storyline. Your red, not red herring. In Dutch we call it a red thread. your quest line, the major points. This is a bad guy, that's what he does. Put it into your world, and then add the micro writing so you can write out your storyline. Yeah, that's what I wanted to get to. So keep on writing. Don't hesitate, by the way, to tell me about your world. Maybe I can steal stuff for my... No. I'm just really interested in what people write about. I like to read now and then, so a bit of lore here and there. Currently, I'm playing in a series of one-shots in a friend of mine who started designing his own world, and that's a lot of fun because you don't know what's going to happen. You know nothing about the world, and you're discovering it as you go. And that's really fun for the players. Maybe if you're not convinced by my arguments, as a player who plays the Forgotten Realms all the time, you know the lore of the Forgotten Realms. You will not easily be surprised by aspects of the world because it's the Forgotten Realms. There you go. But if you're entering a completely new world, there's a lot of things to discover. And remember that as a dungeon master as well, if your players are really into exploring and discovering, don't overfeed them information. Allow them to discover. There we are. That's what I wanted to talk about today. I wanted to do something for dungeon masters. There we are. Attic Dungeon. Peace out. See you all in 2 weeks.